What happens when a beloved TV star completely loses it on live television? In just 23 seconds, Tony Robinson went from charming guest to furious enemy, storming off Lorraine Kelly's show in what might be the most shocking exit we've ever seen on British daytime TV. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals, the confrontations they don't want you to see, and the moments that shake the entertainment industry to its core. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Last night's episode of The Lorraine Show started off like any other morning broadcast. The studio lights were bright. The audience was eager. Coffee mugs with the show's logo sat steaming on the desk, and Lorraine Kelly sat behind her desk with that familiar warm smile she's known for across Britain. The makeup artists had done their final touches, the producers had given the countdown, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Tony Robinson, the actor famous for playing Baldric in Blackadder and his various historical documentaries, walked onto the set, waving to the crowd with that cheeky grin he's perfected over decades in the entertainment business. The audience clapped enthusiastically as he settled into the famous orange sofa, adjusting his jacket and accepting a mug of tea from one of the crew members. Everyone in that studio, from the camera operators to the people watching at home, expected a light chat about his latest projects, maybe some nostalgic stories from his decades in the business, perhaps a funny anecdote or two about his time on Blackadder with Rowan Atkinson. This was supposed to be easy, comfortable, the kind of morning television that people watch while eating their breakfast. Nobody, and I mean nobody, could have predicted the absolute chaos that was about to unfold. Lorraine started things off pleasant enough, complimenting Tony on his recent documentary work and asking about his passion for history. She mentioned how much she'd enjoyed his series on British castles and asked him what drew him to these historical subjects. Tony seemed relaxed, laughing easily and sharing anecdotes about his adventures exploring ancient sites around Britain, talking about getting stuck in a medieval tunnel in Wales, and the time he'd accidentally set off an alarm in a museum by getting too close to a Viking artifact. The audience laughed along. Lorraine smiled warmly, and for those first few minutes, everything was exactly as it should be. The conversation flowed smoothly, touching on his early career, his love of archaeology, and his upcoming book. Then, about 7 minutes into the interview, Lorraine shifted gears, and you could almost feel the atmosphere in the studio change. "Tony, I have to ask you about something that's been causing quite a stir online," Lorraine said, her tone still friendly, but with a hint of something sharper underneath. "You made some comments last week about the state of British television, specifically about how morning shows have become too soft, too afraid to ask real questions. Were you referring to shows like mine?" You could see Tony's face change immediately. His smile didn't exactly disappear, but it became tighter, more forced. The easy laughter from moments before vanished completely. He shifted in his seat, crossing and then uncrossing his legs, and let out a small laugh that didn't reach his eyes. There was an awkward pause, just a couple of seconds, but it felt much longer. "Well, Lorraine," Tony said slowly, carefully choosing his words, "I think if you actually listened to what I said, instead of reading whatever tabloid headline you found, you'd understand I was talking about the industry as a whole, not any specific person or show." Lorraine's smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed just slightly. Anyone who knew her well could see that something had shifted in her demeanor. "I did listen to the full interview, Tony. I listened to every word. You specifically mentioned morning presenters who prioritize celebrity gossip over substance, who would rather talk about what someone had for breakfast than what they think about the world. That sounds pretty specific to me. That sounds like you were talking about morning shows exactly like this one." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Members of the audience started glancing at each other, sensing something uncomfortable brewing. This wasn't the warm, fuzzy conversation they'd expected. The camera operators adjusted their positions, making sure they captured both Tony and Lorraine's faces clearly. Tony sat up straighter in his chair, and his jaw clenched slightly. "What I meant," Tony said, his words coming faster now, with an edge creeping into his voice, was that television has changed dramatically over the years, and not necessarily for the better. When I started in this business, when I was a young actor doing my first television interviews, interviewers asked challenging questions. They weren't afraid to make their guests think, to push them a little bit. They held people accountable for what they said and did. Now it's all puff pieces and promotional tours. It's all softball questions and letting celebrities talk about their latest project without any real substance. It's boring, it's safe, and quite frankly, it's insulting to viewers' intelligence. People are smarter than you give them credit for. Lorraine's famous warmth was starting to crack now. You could hear it in her voice, see it in the way she held her shoulders. Her Scottish accent became more pronounced as she leaned forward, placing both hands flat on her desk. Boring and safe? Tony, I've been doing this job for over 30 years. 30 years of getting up at ridiculous hours, of preparing for interviews, of genuinely caring about the people who sit on that sofa. I've interviewed politicians who've tried to dodge questions, activists fighting for important causes, survivors of tragedies who've shared the most painful moments of their lives. I've covered serious issues like mental health, domestic violence, cancer, grief, alongside the lighter content. I've cried with guests, I've laughed with them, I've given them a platform to tell stories that matter. Are you really sitting there suggesting that I don't ask challenging questions? Are you really saying that what I do doesn't have value? I'm suggesting that maybe you used to do those things. Tony shot back, and now the gloves were definitely coming off. His voice got sharper, louder. But somewhere along the way, you and shows like yours became more interested in protecting your guests' feelings than getting to the truth. You became more concerned with ratings and keeping sponsors happy than actually doing journalism. When was the last time you made someone genuinely uncomfortable with a question? When was the last time you pushed back on something instead of just nodding and smiling and saying, "Oh, that's wonderful," or "how marvelous about everything"? You've become predictable, Lorraine. You've become safe. And safe television is dead television. The audience gasped audibly. Several people in the front row put their hands over their mouths in shock. You don't talk to Lorraine Kelly like that on British television. She's a national treasure, beloved by millions, someone who's been invited into people's homes every morning for decades. But Tony wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed to be gaining momentum, like he'd been holding these thoughts in for years and was finally letting them all pour out. Lorraine's voice remained steady, but there was steel in it now, a hardness that rarely appears on screen. That's quite an accusation, Tony. That's quite a serious accusation to make on live television, especially coming from someone who's here to promote his new book about community and bringing people together, which, I might add, you haven't mentioned yet because you've been too busy criticizing the format of the show you agreed to appear on, the show that invited you here, gave you a platform, and welcomed you with open arms. "Oh, here we go," Tony said, throwing his hands up in a gesture of exasperation. "Of course, can't handle a bit of criticism, can't handle someone telling you the truth, so you make it about the book. You make it about promotion. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is precisely the problem. The moment someone says something you don't like, the moment someone challenges you or makes you feel uncomfortable, you deflect. You change the subject. You try to make the person asking questions feel guilty or ungrateful. You make it personal, instead of addressing the actual point being made." "I'm not making it personal, Tony," Lorraine responded, her voice rising slightly now, losing some of that careful control. "You're the one who came on my show and decided to insult me and my work. You're the one making personal attacks. If you have such a problem with morning television, if you think it's all so terrible and meaningless, why did you agree to come here? Why not just turn down the invitation? Why not stay home if you think we're all so beneath you?" Tony laughed, but it was a harsh, bitter sound with no humor in it whatsoever. Because my publisher insisted, that's why. Because apparently, even though I've been in this business for 50 bloody years, I still need to sit on your sofa and pretend everything is wonderful and play the game. I need to smile and nod and talk about my favorite biscuits or whatever inane question you've got prepared. Because that's how books get sold now. That's how the industry works. But you know what? I'm tired of playing the game. I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of sitting through these ridiculous interviews where nothing of substance ever gets said. The tension in the studio was becoming unbearable now. You could cut it with a knife. Camera operators were looking at each other nervously, unsure whether to keep filming or if someone was going to step in and stop this disaster. The producers in the control room must have been losing their minds, shouting into headsets, trying to figure out how to salvage this train wreck. This was live television, broadcast across the entire country, and it was spiraling completely out of control. People watching at home were probably calling their friends, texting their family members, posting on social media about what they were witnessing. Lorraine took a deep breath, clearly trying to maintain her composure, trying to be the professional she's always been. Tony, I think maybe we should take a moment and step back here. This conversation has gotten very heated. And no, let's not take a moment. Tony interrupted sharply, his voice getting even louder. Let's not pretend we're going to take a break and come back and everything will be fine. Let's actually have a real conversation for once. Let's talk about how morning television has become this sanitized, corporate-approved wasteland where nobody says anything remotely interesting or controversial anymore. Let's talk about how presenters like you have become so obsessed with being liked, so desperate to maintain this perfect image, that you've forgotten how to be journalists. You've forgotten how to do anything except smile and be pleasant and make everyone feel comfortable. That was the breaking point. That was the moment when Lorraine Kelly, known for her warmth and kindness, finally snapped. Her face flushed red, and her voice became sharp as a knife, cutting through the studio. Journalists, Tony, you're an actor. You're an actor who plays pretend for a living. You read lines that other people write for you. You dress up in costumes and say words from a script. You've done some documentaries, yes, but you're not a journalist. You're not a reporter. Don't you dare sit there and lecture me about journalism when you've never done a day of actual reporting in your entire life. You've never had to chase a story, verify sources, or make difficult editorial decisions. At least I admit what I am, Tony fired back immediately. Not missing a beat. At least I'm honest about it. I don't pretend to be some hard-hitting interviewer while I'm asking celebrities about their favorite recipes and their summer holiday plans and what moisturizer they use. You know what you are, Lorraine? You're a glorified talk show host who's been playing the same character for 30 years. The friendly neighbor, the warm auntie, the woman who everyone loves. It's an act, and we both know it. It's a performance, just like any acting role. Except you've been doing it so long you probably believe it yourself. But I see through it. Everyone in this industry sees through it. They just don't say it to your face. The studio fell completely. Silent. Even the camera operators seemed frozen in place. Lorraine's face had gone from red to pale, completely drained of color, and her hands were gripping the edge of her desk so tightly her knuckles were white. For a moment, she just stared at Tony, and you could see something breaking inside her, something that had been holding strong for 3 decades of television, finally giving way. "How dare you?" she said quietly at first, but her voice carried across the entire studio like a whip crack. "How dare you come onto my show, into my house, the show I've built, and speak to me like that? I have dedicated my entire career, my entire adult life, to making people feel welcome, to creating a space where guests feel comfortable sharing their stories, where they can be themselves without fear of judgment. I've given platforms to people who needed voices. I've highlighted causes that matter. I've tried to bring some light and warmth into people's mornings. And you have the audacity, the sheer audacity, to call that fake? To call that an act? If the shoe fits," Tony muttered, but loud enough for everyone to hear. That was it. That was the moment everything exploded beyond any hope of recovery. Lorraine stood up from her desk, something she almost never does during an interview unless she's saying goodbye to a guest. But this wasn't goodbye. This was something entirely different. Her eyes were blazing with an anger that nobody watching had ever seen from her before. "Get out," she said, her voice trembling with barely controlled fury. "Get out of my studio, right now. I mean it, Tony. Get out." Tony looked genuinely surprised for the first time since the argument started. His eyebrows shot up and his mouth fell open slightly. "What? You're joking. You heard me perfectly well. Get the hell out. I don't care about your book. I don't care about your opinions on television. And I certainly don't care to sit here for one more second and be insulted by someone who clearly has no respect for what we do here. No respect for me, and no respect for this audience. You came here as a guest, and you've acted like an absolute arse. Leave. Now. Right now." For a moment, Tony just sat there on that orange sofa as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening, as if his brain was struggling to process that he, Tony Robinson, was actually being kicked off a morning talk show on live television. The audience was dead silent, every single person holding their collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Some people in the audience looked shocked, others looked angry, and a few even looked like they were about to cry. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a genuine fight, a real falling out, happening in front of millions of viewers. Then Tony's face hardened, his jaw set, and he stood up from the sofa with sharp, angry movements. "Fine," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "Absolutely fine. I didn't want to be here anyway. This whole thing is beneath me. This whole charade, this whole fake morning show nonsense, I should never have agreed to come. Clearly nothing is beneath you, Tony, since you're willing to come on television and act like a complete and utter arse." Lorraine shot back, and the audience gasped again at hearing her swear, something she almost never ever does on air. "You came here supposedly to talk about kindness and community, and instead you've shown yourself to be rude, arrogant, and cruel." Tony started unhooking his microphone, fumbling with the wire pack on his belt in his anger, his hands shaking with rage. "You know what your problem is, Lorraine? You know what's really going on here? You can't handle the truth. You've been coddled by this industry for so long, praised and celebrated, and told how wonderful you are, that the moment someone tells you how it really is, the moment someone dares to be honest with you, you completely fall apart. You can't take criticism. You're too fragile. The only thing falling apart here is your reputation," Lorraine said, her voice icy cold now, colder than anyone had ever heard it. "And you're doing it all by yourself. Nobody forced you to come here and behave like this. Nobody made you act like a bitter old man who can't stand that the world has moved on without him. Nobody made you insult me and my work. You did that all on your own." "Bitter?" Tony's voice rose to almost a shout now, loud enough that the audio technicians probably had to adjust their levels. "I'm not bitter. I'm honest. There's a difference. I'm saying what everyone else in this building is thinking, but is too scared to say. Something you wouldn't recognize if it hit you in the face. You and everyone else in this building, everyone in this industry, are so busy protecting your precious image, so concerned with being loved and adored, that you've forgotten what real television looks like. You've forgotten what it means to take risks, to challenge people, to actually make them think about something. And what does real television look like, Tony? This? Is this what you think real television is?" Lorraine's voice was matching his in volume now. A grown man throwing a tantrum on live television because he didn't get enough attention? A supposed adult insulting his host because he's upset about the state of the industry? Is this what you think good television is? Because from where I'm standing, it just looks sad and pathetic. Tony finally got his microphone off completely and threw it down on the sofa with force, the sound of it hitting the cushions audible even without being mic'd up. "It's better than the garbage you put out every single morning. At least people will actually remember this. At least something real happened here today. At least this is genuine. When was the last time anything real happened on this show? When was the last time you had an actual conversation instead of reading from your pre-approved script and asking your safe little questions? When was the last time someone left this studio having actually said something that mattered? Lorraine walked out from behind her desk now, stepping onto the studio floor, standing at full height in her heels and dress, and despite being physically smaller than Tony, she somehow seemed to tower over him with the sheer force of her presence and her anger. You want real? Here's real, Tony. Here's the truth. You came on my show this morning to promote a book about kindness and community, about how we all need to be better to each other in these difficult times, about how we should treat people with respect and understanding. Those are your words, your message. And yet you've spent the last 15 minutes being cruel, insulting, and deeply disrespectful to someone who welcomed you with open arms, who was excited to have you here, who wanted to give you a platform to share your message. You're a hypocrite, Tony Robinson. You're a complete and utter hypocrite. And everyone watching right now, everyone in this studio, everyone at home, can see it clear as day. Tony's face turned bright red, a deep crimson color that spread from his neck all the way to his forehead. He pointed a finger directly at Lorraine, his entire hand shaking with rage, jabbing it in her direction. Don't you dare call me a hypocrite. Don't you bloody dare. You don't know anything about me or what I stand for. You don't know what I've done, what I've fought for, what I believe in. You know nothing. I know exactly what you stand for. Self-righteousness and ego. That's what I know. That's what everyone can see right now. Now get off my set before I have security physically escort you out. And believe me, Tony, I will do it. I will call them right now if you don't leave. For a long, terrible moment that seemed to stretch on forever, they just stared at each other, both breathing hard, both visibly furious, faces flushed, fists clenched. The clenched entire studio seemed to be holding its breath. The silence was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Everyone just watched this unprecedented confrontation unfold in real time. Then Tony shook his head slowly, let out a harsh, contemptuous laugh, and turned toward the exit, muttering under his breath. This is bloody ridiculous, he said loudly enough for the cameras to pick up, walking past the audience members who were sitting frozen in shock. Absolute waste of my time. Complete joke of a show. The feeling is mutual, Tony, Lorraine called after him, still standing by her desk with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Believe me, the feeling is entirely mutual. Tony stopped at the very edge of the set, right where the studio lights ended and the backstage darkness began. He turned back one more time, one final parting shot, his face still red with anger. You're going to regret this, Lorraine. Everyone's going to see what you're really like now. Everyone's going to see the mask slip. You're not the sweet, kind person everyone thinks you are. You're just as nasty as everyone else. When someone challenges you, the only person who should have regrets is you, Lorraine replied, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly running through her. The only person who's shown their true colors here today is you, Tony. Now leave before you embarrass yourself any further. You've done quite enough damage already. Tony's mouth opened, as if he was going to say something else, something even worse, perhaps the final insult that would make this whole situation completely irreparable. His face contorted with anger and frustration, but then he seemed to think better of it, or maybe he just ran out of things to say. He clenched his jaw tight, shook his head one more time in disgust and disbelief, turned sharply on his heel, and stormed off the set, his footsteps echoing loudly in the shocked silence. He nearly knocked over a camera operator on his way out, not even stopping to apologize or acknowledge what he'd done, just barreling through toward the exit like a man possessed. The studio doors slammed shut behind him with a loud bang that made several audience members jump in their seats, and then he was gone, disappeared into the backstage area, leaving behind nothing but stunned silence and the wreckage of what had been supposed to be a pleasant morning interview. The studio remained in shocked, absolute silence for what felt like several minutes, but was probably only about 10 seconds. Lorraine stood there in the middle of the studio floor, still visibly shaking with anger and adrenaline, her face flushed, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths as she tried to regain her composure. Her hands were trembling slightly. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay quiet, whether this was the kind of moment that deserved cheering or if that would be inappropriate. Some people looked like they wanted to comfort her, others looked angry on her behalf, and a few still just looked completely shocked by what they'd witnessed. Finally, Lorraine took a long, deep breath, smoothed down her dress with both hands, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and walked back behind her desk with as much dignity as she could muster. Her heels clicked on the studio floor with each step. She sat down carefully in her chair and placed her hands flat on the desk in front of her, clearly trying to ground herself, to find her center again after that explosive confrontation. "Well," she said, and her voice was slightly unsteady at first, a slight tremor running through it. "That certainly wasn't what we had planned for this morning's show. That wasn't what anyone expected or wanted. I apologize to everyone watching at home for what you just witnessed. That was unprofessional and completely unacceptable behavior, and it has absolutely no place on this show or any show." She paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts, choosing her words carefully. You could see her jaw working as she considered what to say next. Tony Robinson was invited here this morning to discuss his work, to talk about his new book, to have a pleasant and hopefully interesting conversation with our audience. That's what we do here every single day. We create a space for people to share their stories, their projects, their lives. And instead of doing that, instead of being a gracious guest, he chose to attack me personally and professionally. He chose to insult this show, to insult our viewers, and to behave in a way that I frankly find shocking and deeply disappointing. Her voice grew stronger now, more confident, as she continued. "I have spent 3 decades building this show, 30 years of hard work and dedication, 3 decades of getting up before dawn, of preparing interviews, of doing my absolute best to create a space where people feel safe to share their stories, where we can have both fun conversations and serious discussions about things that matter. I won't apologize for that work. I won't apologize for creating something warm and welcoming. And I certainly won't be made to feel ashamed of it by someone who clearly has his own issues to work through, his own bitterness to deal with." The audience began to clap, tentatively at first, just a few people starting slowly, unsure if it was the right thing to do. But then it grew, spreading through the studio like a wave, getting louder and more supportive with each passing second. People started standing up, giving Lorraine a standing ovation, showing their support for her after what she'd just been through. Some people were even wiping tears from their eyes, moved by her strength and dignity in the face of such aggressive and uncalled-for treatment. Lorraine managed a small, grateful smile, and you could see her eyes getting a bit watery as well, though she blinked rapidly to keep any tears from falling. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all so much. That means more to me than you know. It really does. We're going to take a quick break now," she said, looking directly into the camera with red-rimmed but determined eyes. "We need a moment to collect ourselves. And quite honestly, I think we all need to process what just happened. When we come back in a few minutes, we'll try to salvage what's left of this morning with something a bit more cheerful, something more positive. I promise you. I absolutely promise you. The rest of the show won't be quite so dramatic or uncomfortable. We'll get back to what we do best, which is having good conversations and hopefully bringing some light into your morning." As the show cut to commercial, the camera stayed on just a fraction of a second longer than usual. In that brief moment, you could see Lorraine finally letting her professional guard down completely. She put her head in her hands, her shoulders sagging, with exhaustion and emotional weight, taking a moment to just be human after having to be so strong. A producer rushed over to her with a tissue and a glass of water. putting a comforting hand on her shoulder.